I've brought you to this dry river valley in southern Spain several times before. I'm not often here in November, but I am this time. The rosemary is in full flower, and so is the thyme. And I'm going to pick some thyme and take it home with me. I used to think I wasn't allowed to do that, but apparently if it's for personal use, you don't need a phytosanitary certificate. So I'm going to find some nice, here's a nice one that's not actually in flower. Just have a check, and yeah, it's definitely thyme. So I'm going to pick some sprigs of thyme, dry them in the sun before I go back, bag it all up and take home some Spanish thyme. So I'm not going to pick too much from any one place. There's loads of really big, this is a really, really big thyme bush here. Look at the size of this plant. Another one here. So just pick a few little sprigs from each plant so we're not destroying anything. And then, well, I said I was going to hang it up in the sun to dry. I'm actually going to hang it up in the shade to dry because the sun will just evaporate the volatiles out of it. But yeah, we'll make sure that we leave plenty for the bees. In addition to thyme, there are a lot of other similar looking plants down here. This is not thyme, I don't know what that is. That's lavender there, which is aromatic, but it's not what I want. So I mean, it's a little bit easier to tell the difference between all these plants in person than it would be on video. But the easiest way to tell the difference is to wait until they flower. And so I'm picking from the bushes that are in flower. Obviously I can differentiate by rubbing the plant and having a sniff, because I know what thyme smells like. But yeah, picking it when it's got these little pale purple flowers on it is one way to be completely sure about what we're getting. So back here at the apartment, I'm just going to put that bunch of thyme in a glass like that, on a plate to catch any leaves that dry and fall off on their own. That I'll just leave it to dry out naturally. So after just a couple of days in the warm Spanish climate, these sprigs of thyme are now completely dry. Now the reason I did this with thyme and not rosemary is the smaller leaves dry out a lot quicker. So now all I need to do is just, on this tray, rub off all the leaves, and then we're collecting all the dried thyme on this tray. Drying this stuff out has not significantly reduced its aroma. Actually, I can really smell it as I'm just rolling these leaves off the twigs like this. Now, I did go out a second day and got another slightly larger bunch of thyme, so I'm going to have plenty of this to take home to experiment with. I'll deal with those twigs in a minute. I'll cook something that hopefully reminds me of this trip.
As I mentioned earlier, I previously thought it was impossible to bring back any sort of plant material without a phytosanitary certificate, but I looked into this and it's not absolute. There is a decision process that takes into account a series of different factors, including the source and destination countries of the movement of materials, the type of plant material. Living, viable plant tissue is generally considered a higher concern than dried or prepared material, although seeds are potentially a concern, and I imagine there are some seeds present in the material I collected. The species of plant matters a lot. There are three categories: high, medium and low risk. Thyme isn't in the high or medium risk categories, which automatically places it in the low risk category, which is everything else. And there are different rules for commercial large-scale importation versus smaller amounts for personal use. It is also stated, but sort of goes without saying, that the materials must be free of obvious pests and diseases. And finally, the intended use of the material is a factor. For example, live plants or tubers intended for planting or growing are treated differently from materials that are cooked or processed or dried and intended for cooking or consumption. It's all quite an interesting read, and I'll link to all of these relevant sites if you want to take a look at it. Some people might scoff at all of this and say to ignore it, but I like to stay on the right side of the law in general anyway, and I suppose that's especially the case when I'm making a video about a thing I did. So I did read through all of the available information in full and carefully, and to the best of my knowledge and understanding, there's nothing in there that should stop me from bringing dehydrated thyme back to the UK from Spain in small amounts for personal use. So we got this lovely thyme that I brought back from Spain, and it smells fantastic. And just the aroma of that reminds me of being there. Let's cook something with this.
I'm going to cook some baked beans flavoured with this thyme. So last night I put some pinto beans in to soak, and this is them this morning. So now we've got to cook these and then make a sauce for them. I'm going to cook them a bit first because the sauce is going to be acidic, and that can make the bean skins go tough. So we'll cook the beans separately and make the sauce in a different pan. So beans drained and rinsed into some fresh water, and we'll get those on to boil. One thing that won't make them go tough is some of this thyme. So I'll put a bit of this in the cooking water. That will infuse into the beans. But we're going to use some more of it in other places too. It's going to be a tomato-based sauce, and we're just going to have celery, peppers, red onion, and some smoked paprika, and of course the thyme. So I'm just going to dice all of these up. Meanwhile, the beans are coming to the boil, so I'm just going to start a timer so I don't lose track of time. They'll need about an hour probably. A bit of olive oil and my diced vegetables. I've also got some garlic. I forgot to mention that earlier. I'll put that in right before I put the wet ingredients in. I'm not going to bother waiting for this oil to heat up because I just want to cook all of these vegetables quite gently to soften them and get all the flavours out of them. So we're just going to cook these really gently. Just a little bit of salt in there, about half a teaspoonful. I think we'll have a bit of black pepper in there as well. Now you might be wondering, you might have picked up that I said I was making baked beans, and we haven't gone anywhere near the oven yet, and we're not going to. So this is not going to be baked in the oven, even though they're called baked beans. Why are they called baked beans when they're not going to be baked? The short answer is that the name that we call things is not necessarily an exact recipe for making them. Hot dogs don't contain very much dog. The slightly longer answer is that baked beans as a culinary entity are based on something that used to be baked, casseroled in an oven. Nowadays, baked beans are more like a stew, but they're still called baked beans. It's now time for the garlic to go in there. I didn't put that in at the start for fear of burning it, but to be honest, there's enough other moist ingredients in here to make sure that that wouldn't happen anyway. But it's smaller pieces, so it can go in now. Now it's time for thyme. And since this ingredient really is the star of the show, we're going for, that's more than a teaspoonful of dried thyme. It's quite a strong herb. And this Spanish wild thyme that I picked is quite a strong example of thyme as well. And most of the aroma in thyme is oil based, so it's oil soluble. So that will dissolve into the oil that these vegetables are frying in. That will infuse into that. I think these vegetables are now sufficiently cooked. So I'm going to clear a space in the hottest part of the pan here. A little bit more oil. And then a good squeeze of tomato puree. I'll just give that a chance to fry before we add the wet ingredients. So, I don't think the camera was rolling there. So I put some smoked paprika in and then quickly put in my tomato passata. But there's still some left in the carton here, so I'll just rinse that out with a bit of water. We might actually just have a little bit more water just to loosen things up. Now we need to simmer this until those vegetables soften further. Did I just go over the edge there? I did. I'm also going to have a heaped teaspoonful of sweet paprika. I'm just going to put that on there so that the tomatoes don't spit everywhere. Now is a good moment to have a little taste of this sauce, and we'll figure out if it needs any additional seasoning or anything. I think it could do with a little bit of sweetness. Not much, but I think just about a teaspoon and a half of sugar in there. Guess how high up on the ingredients list sugar is going to be on that tin of baked beans. I don't know myself, but it's going to be on there somewhere. Let's have a look then. So, ingredients: haricot beans, tomato puree, water, sugar, glucose fructose syrup. So yeah, it's the fourth ingredient after water. My tomato sauce here is not going to be quite as sugary as that, at least not from added sugar. Of course, all of those vegetables contain sugar, and there's no
functional difference between added sugar and natural sugar as far as your body's concerned. Anyway, let's give that a taste now. Let's see if that's made the required difference. That's good. The acidity of the tomatoes is now better balanced by that little bit of sugar. Sugar doesn't neutralise acidity, but it does balance it in terms of how your body will perceive sweetness versus sourness. And I can taste the thyme in there, but not as much as I'd like to. So I'm going to put a little bit more in. So that's now about 2 teaspoons full of that wild dried thyme in there, which is quite a lot, but I do want it to be a noticeable flavour. All right, that sauce is done now. That's achieved the right consistency. The vegetables are nicely softened. It's not going to be smooth. I mean, I could blend that and make it a nice smooth sauce, but I quite like having the little bits of vegetables visible in the sauce. Anyway, that's going to be turned off now and just wait for the beans to be finished cooking. Now, of course, nearly all canned food is heated in a pressure vessel after the cans are sealed. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to call that an oven or to call that process baking. And if that was baking, then wouldn't this be baked soup? Anyway, yeah, short answer is baked beans. The name is an idiom at this point. It's not a recipe for the product. Okay, we're just coming up to the 50-minute mark. Let's check on these beans. I think these are done. We'll just, yeah, they crush easily. I'll just taste one. Yeah. And when the steam clears, yeah, just have another little test of those beans. Yeah, they're completely soft. So drained beans back in the pan, off the heat for a moment. And now the sauce. So that's just going to go back on the heat for a few moments, and now that those beans are cooked, I don't need to worry about the sauce toughening the skins, but I am just going to simmer them in this sauce just for a few minutes, just to let the flavours cook into the beans a little bit. Okay, there we go, homemade baked beans with Spanish thyme. A little final taste for seasoning now everything's together. No, there's nothing I want to change there. So, how are we going to serve these? Well, obviously, on toast. A couple of slices of nice toast. Just put them like that for a moment to let the steam escape. Butter. I like to kind of cut them into almost triangles. They just tessellate a bit better on the plate. Okay, time for the beans. Not your regular baked beans, but that's my kind of brunch this morning. Baked beans on toast, flavoured with wild Spanish thyme. A memory of my trip to Spain to see my mum. So, I mean, I've already spoiled it by tasting the beans when they're in the pot, but here we go. The wild thyme flavour is quite prominent, but also it's not overpowering. It's just a lovely aromatic herbal flavour that reminds me of the aromas I experienced in, first hand walking up that valley where we picked the thyme. The sauce is not as syrupy as, canned baked beans. Definitely a lot more rustic in its texture, but I like it for that. I'm very pleased with this outcome, and yeah, that just reminds me of the aromas in that valley where we picked the thyme. There's plenty more of that thyme in the little jar, so it'll probably show up in future videos as well. In case you're wondering what will happen with the leftovers, these will freeze just fine. So this container I think we'll just put in the fridge, and I'll probably have that tomorrow. These two, that's equivalent to about a can of beans, so once those have cooled, lid on, they'll go in the freezer. I'll take them out at some future point and use them instead of a can of beans. There is one other culinary souvenir from my recent trip to Spain, which we'll look at next. Here's something ever so slightly strange: tomato jam. I brought this back from Spain. Of course, I've heard of tomato jam before. And you can buy things called tomato jam in the UK, although I think very often if you buy something called tomato jam here, it will tend to be a savoury product. It'll tend to be a pickle or a sauce of some sort for perhaps serving with cheese. This is, honest to goodness, tomato jam. Ingredients, basically tomatoes, sugar and pectin. And it was alongside all of the other breakfast jams, the apricot, the strawberry, the blueberry jam in Mercadona in Spain. So I picked up a jar because I've never tried this. Now this might be a really common thing where you live, but as I say, not so here. Okay, so it has got the seeds in it. And yeah, it smells of tomatoes. I'm going to taste a little bit on its own and then we'll try a bit on toast. So yeah, looks like a jam. It is jellified. It is set with pectin. So what does it taste like? Yeah, it's a sweet jam. It doesn't immediately taste like tomatoes at all. It just tastes fruity and sweet, like a strawberry jam or something. I'm going to try it on a nice piece of warm toast and we'll see what it's like in that context. Now, I have no real idea how this is typically eaten, but it was, as I say, with all of the other breakfast jams, so I'm going to treat it in similar fashion. It's very wobbly. Now, I should say that while I was waiting for my toast to toast, the flavours of that little taste of tomato jam came out a bit more, and it was very strange. I've eaten sweet flavoured tomato relatives before, like Cape gooseberries. This is not like that. The savoury notes of the tomato did actually come out later than the sweet ones. And so it was almost like I'd eaten something sweet and then some tomatoes afterwards. Anyway, let's give that a try. It is very odd, and especially here with the bread. The bread is bringing out some of the savoury notes. So this really can't decide whether it wants to be sweet or savoury. It's an interesting thing. So yeah, very odd, but quite a welcome kind of oddness. That has given me some ideas though, for things like, perhaps we could use this as a sauce on pizza with some sweet cheese and make a kind of dessert pizza that's still tomato and cheese. Ideas. So this tomato jam, I had an idea. What about a savoury cream tea to eat this with? For the uninitiated, a cream tea is a light meal consisting of scones or scones, if you prefer, topped with optionally butter, clotted cream and jam, not necessarily in that order. And I don't think I'm the first person to think of a savoury version of that, but anyway, let's see what we can make. So I'm going to make cheese scones, which are naturally savoury anyway, but I'm going to make them a little bit more savoury with some extra additions. So I've got about 225 grams of flour, about half wholemeal and half white. This is self-raising flour, but I've also got a teaspoonful of baking powder, 50 grams of butter, a teaspoon of dry mustard. You could just use a mustard from a jar of mustard if you wanted to. A half a teaspoon of salt, a heaped teaspoon of my wild thyme, a teaspoon of black pepper, 100 grams of grated red Leicester cheese, mature red Leicester cheese. And sweet scones are often fruited with chunks of dried fruit, raisins or other dried fruit. I thought we might replace that with some sliced pork cabanossi. 50 grams of that sliced into little thin rounds. And then some milk to mix, probably about 100 ml of milk, or maybe 150 ml of milk to mix. So let's make the scones. All of the dry ingredients are going to go into the bowl here. So flour, baking powder, salt, thyme, mustard, black pepper. And I'll just give that a little mix just to disperse those flavours through the flour. And then the butter. This is cold butter. I'll cut it up into coarse chunks. And we're going to rub that into the flour, which you could just do with your fingers, although I've got a bit of a boo-boo on my thumb, so I can't. So we'll use the rubbing in tool. This is a flour rubbing tool. We just repeatedly cut through the flour like this, and it cuts the fat into smaller and smaller chunks, rubbing it into the flour. Every now and again we have to stop and just clear off the chunks that are stuck on there. blending this fat and flour until we can't see any large chunks of fat. My oven is preheating to 210 degrees Celsius fan oven, which converts to these temperatures here. That's it. Okay, pretty well blended mixture. Now my cabanossi slices and the grated cheese. Quite a lot of cheese, but no point doing things by halves. And I'm just going to toss that together to combine it. I suppose we could probably mix with a knife, although some people don't like mixing with a knife, apparently. All right, that's looking good. So now we're just going to add enough milk to bring this together into a really, really loose mixture. It doesn't want to be a batter. It doesn't want to even be really a dough. It just needs to be wet crumbs. So we'll start with about 75 ml of milk there. And just give that a mix. You may not need much more than that. The trick with scones is to try to mix as little as possible, because we really want it to be crumbly, not doughy. Another little splash of milk. That's probably about 110 ml in total, and that looks good. That doesn't look like it's coming together as a dough, but it is. We'll get this mixture out onto a floured surface, and it's going to be just a pile of crumbs, and that's fine. And the temptation here, if you're a person who makes bread regularly, the temptation here is to knead this. We're not going to do that. All we're actually going to do is squeeze it into a coherent mass like this. Not actually working it and folding it and kneading it at all. We're just going to squeeze it into a lump. A bit more flour on top, and then we'll just roll that out into a flat sheet. Going for about probably 2 centimeters thick, maybe. I don't know how well this is going to cut because of the cabanossi pieces in it, but we'll give it our best shot. So pastry cutter. And we'll just cut straight down like that. Now invariably there is some dough left over, and we will have to knead this to get it back into a piece to make sure we don't waste the last bit. But we'll get 4 hopefully perfect scones out of this. So those are my best ones. Then there's all of this. And I suppose what we might try to do is just not knead it, but just squish it back together. The scones we get out of this will not be quite so pretty. It is a inevitable part of the process, really. Okay, and then this last little bit, not going to try and cut that, we'll just roll it into a rock cake. A lightly oiled baking tray, and we'll get those on there. So these will need baking in the oven for 7 to 10 minutes, not very long. Scones don't take a long time to bake. That's part of the reason they exist. Actually, they are a quick bread. So, off to the oven. I nearly forgot this bit. I'm just going to brush the top of these with milk. Now, I'll just give them a little bit of brown crust on top. Okay, now off to the oven. We'll start with 7 minutes, see how we go. Well, that's the 7-minute mark, and they do smell fantastic, but I think they need a little bit longer. So I'm going to go for another 3 minutes, so 10 minutes in total. Right, those look pretty good. They've risen a fair bit. So we're just going to carefully transfer them onto this wire rack. The cheese will tend to make them stick on the baking tray a little bit, so the palette knife is a really useful way to get them off. And they're very, very delicate at the moment, so we need to be careful with them. Those need to cool for probably 20 minutes at the very least. Probably 45 minutes would be better. We're going to eat them when they're still ever so slightly warm and fresh and fluffy, but if we try to split those now, they'd just fall apart, and actually they'd be quite doughy inside. The cooked flour needs to set. Okay, so savoury cream tea, here we go. Actually, one of the best looking scones is one of the ones that was reformed. I'm pretty sure that is a reformed one from the crumbs. But anyway, we'll take one of these and carefully split it. So I'm just going to poke it like this. We could do this with a fork actually. This is a bit like this method for splitting muffins, but this will give us a fairly reliable split. We could just cut it in half, but there we go. Wow, look how crumbly and fluffy it is inside. All right, so in place of the clotted cream, how about some cheese spread with herbs? So this is our creamy layer. And the jammy bit, tomato jam. And I just had an idea. Now this might be a little bit too far, but these are the cold baked beans from yesterday. Okay. Baked beans on my savoury cream tea. Have you ever seen that before? Right, I'll just stop and get a thumbnail and then we'll give that a taste. Okay, well, I was going to say start with the most normal one first, but I'm not even sure what that is. I suppose it's the one with jam. So there we go. That's my savoury cream tea. Tomato jam, herby cheese spread on a very savoury scone. I think if you took a bite of that, you wouldn't guess that that was supposed to be a cream tea. The appearance obviously is right, but the flavour is nothing like a cream tea. It's really nice, but it's completely different. And the beanie one. Let's try the beanie one. Not everybody's a fan of cold beans, but I don't mind. I actually think that one works a bit better. The sweet and savoury is often a good combination, but it doesn't quite work here. This entirely savoury cream tea with beans, with baked beans on it, it does work. So, now this is a thing I always forget to do, so let's not forget this time. What about both together? This is a thing people always ask for, and it's a thing I don't usually remember to do in the video, so let's give that a try all together. Different again. I think probably better than the jam on its own, but not as good as the beans on their own. The scones, I know this is blowing my own trumpet, but the scones with a little bit of cabanossi in there, and all of the other savoury ingredients as well, including the thyme, which was supposed to be the subject of this video, really works well with the cheese and the mustard and the black pepper. It's fantastic flavours. This is not toast, but the toast tax collector has arrived. Good cow. So there we go. Spanish wild thyme, plenty left in the pot. That's going to appear in future videos, no doubt. Tomato jam, culinary souvenirs from my recent trip to Spain. I hope that's been a bit of fun. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.